Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, a podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 58, and today I want to look at an alternative version of the Christmas story. Most of us are familiar with some kind of version of the Christmas story. Mary and Joseph go down to Bethlehem in response to a census that's been called. They go there to register, and while they're there, Mary, who's heavily pregnant, gives birth to Jesus, and she lies him in a manger. Shepherds come, they've been abiding in the fields nearby, shepherds come to worship. Magi or wise men come and present gifts. There's a star over where Jesus lay, and all these kind of details come together in our harmonized retelling of this story. Of course, the elements in the story are from Matthew's Gospel and Luke's Gospel, and our versions of the Christmas story are different sorts of harmonizations of those two versions, and we've talked a bit about those in previous episodes of the NT Pod. But what I'd like to look at this time is an alternative version of the Christmas story, or should we say a supplementary version of the Christmas story that is not quite as ancient as Matthew's and Luke's version, but is still pretty old. It goes back to at least the end of the 2nd or the beginning of the 3rd century, and it's in a book called the Protevangelium of James. That sounds a little bit off-putting. The prot bit in the Protevangelium is like before Evangelium, Gospel. And so when it says Protevangelium of James, what it is saying is that it's a kind of pre-gospel, a prequel to the Gospels. And that's really what the Protevangelium is. It's all the action that we don't get told in Matthew or Luke. It's all about Mary's parents, who are called Joachim and Anna. And it's about how Mary grew up as a child in the temple and how she was pure from birth. The text is kind of obsessed with her virginity and her purity, and it goes to great lengths to explain just how special and set apart and unique she was and how pure she was in every way. And Joseph is depicted there as an older widow. He already has sons, and one of those sons that he has is James, the James that we hear about in the New Testament. And this is the James who is the author, supposed author of the text. Of course, it's not really written by James, the brother of Jesus. It's a later fictional account by somebody pretending to be that James. Like people often did in antiquity, they pretended to be somebody else in order to lend their text a certain kind of legitimacy or authority. And this idea of writing a prequel is something which I think we can resonate with these days because we love prequels, don't we? I mean, just thinking in popular culture, Batman Begins, was a prequel to the whole Batman story, or the most recent of the Star Trek films was going right back to the origins of the team that were on the Enterprise, or you can even think about the Star Wars prequels. Or perhaps not, perhaps best to forget that they exist. But you know what I mean, that we love the different prequels that these days kind of fill out our story and give us a little bit of a fuller idea of what the heroes, the protagonists were actually up to. And so this is really what the Protevangelium of James is. It's taking the gospel accounts and it's using the details that you get there and expanding them by adding a whole fresh amount of detail, all sorts of stuff all about Mary and Joseph before the action that you see in the Gospels begins. But as the narrative goes on, and it's a wonderful narrative to read, very kind of rich in a sort of quasi-biblical style of writing. The author really inhabits the world of Luke's Gospel especially, and Luke's birth narrative especially. And like Luke, he imitates the style of the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible known as the Septuagint. So all the way through, you keep getting these lovely little Semitic style phrases of somebody who's trying to sound like he's writing biblical stuff. But one of the things that's fascinating about the text is that when it gets to the point where Mary and Joseph are finally in Bethlehem, it starts to overlap with the material in the Gospels, and you can see that the Protevangelium is familiar with Matthew and Luke, and to an extent copies out material from Matthew and Luke. Strangely, it misses out the shepherd story, but it does have a story of Jesus' birth, and it's much, much fuller than the very brief notice that you get in either Matthew or Luke, simply that Mary gave birth. And it's that I really want to focus on, because it should be better known. It's a wonderful little story, and I'll read a little bit of the story to you. This section is from chapter 19 of the text, and what's happened is Joseph has gone out to look for a midwife, and he meets this midwife, and she says to Joseph, "Are you of Israel?" And he says to her, "Yes." And she says, "Who is it that bringeth forth in the cave?" And Joseph says, "She that is betrothed to me." And she says, "Is she not your wife?" And Joseph says, "It is Mary that was nurtured up in the temple of the Lord, and I received her to wife by lot, and she is not my wife, but she hath conception by the Holy Ghost." And the midwife then goes on, "Is this the truth?" And Joseph said to her, "Come hither and see." And the midwife went with him. And they stood in the place of the cave, and behold, a bright cloud overshadowing the cave. And the midwife said, "My soul is magnified this day, because mine eyes have seen marvellous things, for salvation is born unto Israel." And immediately the cloud withdrew itself out of the cave, and a great light appeared in the cave, so that our eyes could not endure it. And by little and little that light withdrew itself, until the young child appeared, and it went and took the breast of its mother Mary. And the midwife cried aloud and said, "Great unto me today is this day, in that I have seen this new sight." And the midwife went forth of the cave, and Salome met her. And she said to her, "Salome, Salome, a new sight have I to tell you. A virgin has brought forth, which her nature does not allow." And Salome said, "As the Lord my God lives, if I make not trial and prove her nature, I will not believe that a virgin has brought forth." Just interject at this point to say that it's curious that this midwife finds this character Salome, who is not otherwise introduced. Some people speculate that maybe she's one of Joseph's daughters. Maybe that's who she's supposed to be, but she's not introduced in the text, and maybe she's just supposed to be some kind of random passerby. After all, Salome is a very common name in the 1st and 2nd centuries. But anyway, the narrative goes on with this new character Salome that's been introduced, and she then goes and witnesses the scene. So the midwife goes in, and she says to Mary, "Order yourself, there is no small contention that has arisen concerning thee." And Salome makes trial and cries out and says, "Woe unto mine iniquity and my unbelief, because I have tempted the living God, and lo, my hand falls away from me in fire." So what's happened is Salome has gone in and taken a look, and she has, as soon as she tries to test Mary's virginity, what happens is her hand burns up with fire. And the text then goes on to describe how Salome repents of her unbelief, and her hand then gets restored to her. Salome comes near, takes up the child, and says, "I will do him worship, for a great king is born to Israel." And behold, immediately Salome was healed. She went forth out of the cave justified, and lo, a voice came, saying, "Salome, Salome, tell none of the marvels which you have seen, until the child enter into Jerusalem." It's a remarkable text in all sorts of ways. For one thing, it illustrates the imagination of early Christians that weren't satisfied with just one simple single line of text about Mary giving birth to Jesus. They wanted to know how it happened. They wanted to know the details, and their imaginations ranged across biblical sounding themes and biblical characters and the miraculous and the idea of something supernatural and special and very odd happening. I mean, when you imagine the birth of Jesus, this writer imagines the birth taking place in a cave. I mean, as if they've just kind of been walking down the road in Bethlehem and come across this cave. And that itself is a very interesting reading of the text. But perhaps one of my favourite pieces of the text is a really interesting moment just before the scene that I've just read out and described, where Joseph knows that Mary is about to give birth. It's a little bit like these days where the father will go roaming the corridors of the hospital to see if they can find themselves a nice cooked breakfast. Or is that just me? But it's Joseph goes out and goes for a little explore. And as he's doing this, what happens is he sees the whole of the world just in freeze frame. Everything has stopped, and the narrative just for this section goes into the first person. I'll read a little bit of it to you. I, Joseph, was walking, and I walked not. I looked up to the air and saw in the air in amazement. And I looked up to the pole of heaven and saw it standing still, and the birds of the heaven without motion. And I looked upon the earth, and I saw a dish set, and a workman lying by it, and their hands were in the dish, and they were chewing, but chewed not. And they that were lifting the food lifted it not, and they that put it into the mouth put it in, but the faces of them were still looking upward. And behold, there were sheep being driven, and they went not forward, but stood still. And the shepherd lifted his hand to smite them with his staff, but his hand remained up. And I looked upon the stream of the river, and saw the mouths of the kids upon the water, and they drank not. And of a sudden all things moved onward in their course. It's the most amazing moment. It's trying to describe that moment of a parent not long before a birth takes place, where the entire universe stands still. But because it's Joseph and because it's Jesus about to be born, it's as if the universe really did stand still at that moment. It's an amazing little piece of text, and it probably uses the first person here, not because it's got some sort of first person source or something, but because in literary terms it makes it so much more dramatic. But what are we to make of this text as a piece of history? Well, the text itself probably goes back at least to the early 3rd century. Our earliest textual witness is pretty good, pretty early. It's Papyrus Bodmer 5, and it dates from the 4th century. That's our earliest Greek textual witness, and that's pretty early. That's pretty good textual witness. And the work itself may well have been written as early as the mid-2nd century. That's what some people think. And some people wonder whether it could even have been written as a response to pagan critics of Christianity like Celsus that say that Mary had been seduced by a Roman soldier and that was how she gave birth. That you answer that by stressing how pure she was, not just through the conception of Jesus, but also through her entire life beforehand and even through the birth. It's a remarkable way of thinking about these sorts of issues, and one which we find these days very surprising, but it may be responding to that kind of issue. So I guess that the text is from the late 2nd, maybe early 3rd century. And in terms of whether it contains actual historical information from the 1st century, I doubt that there's any at all. There may just be the odd little historical nugget. Who knows? Perhaps there was a genuine tradition that Mary's parents were called Joachim and Anna. Perhaps there is a remembrance that Joseph was an older man and that he already had sons before he married Mary. But it's very difficult to say anything with any kind of confidence in a work that is as late and so clearly dependent on the texts of Matthew and Luke. But it is a hugely rewarding text to study, not least because it gives you a wonderful insight into the way that the texts of the synoptics were already being read in the 2nd century. It gives you an insight into the Christian imagination that blends its own speculations with a careful reading of Matthew and Luke, a harmonizing of Matthew and Luke, a creative harmonizing of Matthew and Luke, drawing in lots of images from the Old Testament too. And there's something rather interesting about reading that kind of text, because after all, isn't that the invitation to people across the centuries to do the same kind of thing multiple times? After all, isn't it what even the most straightforward, mundane school or church nativity is doing? It's reimagining the story again for another generation. And with that thought, I'd like to wish all of my listeners that celebrate it a very happy Christmas, and thank you for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod. As always, you can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com. You can find this podcast and previous episodes on Duke University's iTunes U, and you can follow me on Twitter at Goodacre, or you can find the Facebook page for the NT Pod at facebook.com/NTPod. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to being with you in 2012. Bye-bye.